So today we've got yet another good talk, and the person who's going to introduce our speaker is Camille George. She is the Associate Vice Provost for Global and Local Engagement. She's also an engineer, a mechanical engineer who has done a lot at this university and around the world with peace engineering and experiential learning. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we've been partners, I just said she was my partner in crime, but I can be more specific. When we started the Christian Faith and Engineering course here more than a decade ago, it was Camille and I who said, how are we going to do this? We put it together. And then John Wentz actually also has taught it, so I have another partner in crime. So Camille George.
Well, welcome everyone this morning, on Saturday morning. Well, it's been a wonderful conference. I'm sure everybody has been stimulated with this conversation, and I'm really personally pleased because, as Barb said, more than a decade ago we had these ideas, and there were no syllabi in the country that we could find, and nobody was in this space. So it's wonderful to see 12, 13 years later that this space is now becoming populated with people. But today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Michael Quinn, who is the Dean of the College of Science and Engineering at Seattle University. Before joining Seattle in 2007, he was a professor of computer science at the University of New Hampshire and Oregon State University. He earned his BS in mathematics from Gonzaga University and an MS in computer science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a PhD in computer science from Washington State University. Before undertaking his PhD studies, he worked for 2 years as a software engineer at Tektronix. Dr. Quinn did pioneering research in the field of parallel computing that resulted in the publication of more than 60 refereed journal and conference papers. His textbooks on parallel computing have been used by hundreds of universities worldwide. Dr. Quinn is also a leader in the field of computer ethics. His textbook, Ethics for the Information Age, explores moral problems related to modern uses of information technology, such as privacy, intellectual property rights, computer security, and software reliability. The book, now in its 7th edition, has been adopted by more than 125 colleges and universities in the United States and many more internationally. The title of his talk today will be Tuning into Ethics. Thank you. Dr. Quinn.
Thank you, Camille. There's always a concern when you're last, right? Is there going to be anything that I can say that hasn't already been said? And indeed, you are going to hear a few echoes or reverberations from presentations and talks that were given yesterday. In particular, I'm going to be talking about Alistair McIntyre, and his name kept coming up yesterday in the context of virtue ethics. I'm pleased, however, to let you know that there is going to be some new material in the talk this morning. And when I'm thinking about the other two keynote presentations, I'm thinking about Brad on Thursday night, and what he was talking about was the importance of teaching students how to ask deep questions, how to look at a problem critically and develop the ability to ask the hard question and see a problem, or see a problem in what might look like really great marketing material. And then last night, Greg was talking about engineering in the real world, and I think what his talk really demonstrated, to me anyway, was the power of real stories and how a story can be so important to a student in terms of helping them understand this is the sort of situation you're going to find yourself in. The contribution I'm going to make this morning, or one of them, is to focus on reflection and how adding reflection to the educational experience is so important to create deep learning and transformation. And that's, I think, a result of me spending so much time at a Jesuit institution where reflection is an important part of Ignatian spirituality. I wonder where I put my thing. Ah, great. So I decided to ground my talk in the call for papers for this conference. And so much of my talk is directed toward the vision of this conference to facilitate discussion of how Christian faith and theology can contribute to a broader culture of ethics and engineering and be integrated with engineering in the lives of individuals. So in the course of my presentation, I'll point out the centrality of ethics to the mission of a Catholic university, and I'll draw upon some of the lessons of Ignatian spirituality as I describe teaching ethics in a way that can truly transform the lives of students. So I'm a dean, as Camille said, and in my role as dean, one of my privileges is to go out and talk with alumni. I'm on the road and talking with alumni all the time. This is a picture of Joe Blasko, electrical engineering class of 1971. And one of the questions I like to ask alumni is, what was your favorite class you ever took at Seattle University? So when I'm talking to these engineers, usually they're in their 60s or 70s, your favorite class, believe it or not, nobody has ever said partial differential equations. What's amazing is the answer that comes up more than any other is ethics. And I say, really? Why, tell me more. Why is ethics the most important class? And they talk about how the ethics class they took at Seattle University prepared them for the decisions that they needed to make throughout their professional lives and also their personal lives. So I think that that's a real message of hope for anybody who has the opportunity to teach an ethics class, because the seeds that we plant today can really grow into some beautiful flowers in the future. Every Catholic university I'm aware of requires teaching an ethics class. And that's completely consistent with the vision of what the role of Catholic universities is in the world. So if we go back to Ex Cordia Ecclesiae, from the heart of the church, so Pope John Paul II, 1991, he talks about what is the central role, or what's the importance of universities. How do universities carry out the mission of the church in the world? And what he says in this document is that Catholic universities are the place where the inspiration and the light of the Christian message encounters modern culture, in particular the study of serious contemporary problems. So to quote Pope John Paul II, in a Catholic university, research necessarily includes A, the search for an integration of knowledge, B, a dialogue between faith and reason, C, an ethical concern, and D, a theological perspective, end quote. So what does that tell us? Research, scholarship, teaching in the area of ethics is fully consistent with the mission of Catholic universities, and it's an important way in which Catholic universities are contributing to modern culture, having an impact or a voice in the modern world. And that voice is certainly needed in today's world. It really isn't surprising that the alumni I visit with appreciate the formal ethics education that they received. When you think about what is the common view of what leads to success in the world, how do you not only keep your job but get promoted? You keep your boss happy. And so how do you keep your boss happy? How do you get those great evaluations? Well, you do what your boss tells you to do, right? What is right in the corporation is what the guy above you wants from you. That's what morality is in the corporation. So there's a strong impetus in society toward defining right and wrong according to relativistic criteria. So isn't that great that we're in a position to provide some formal training in ethics? We're able to provide our students with tools so that they have a framework for thinking about moral decision making and that they can think for themselves and not just follow the crowd. Or one way of looking at it is not to settle for the lowest common denominator, but to seek something higher. So I think an ethics education is central to the mission of a Catholic university in the modern world, and it represents an important way in which Christian culture can contribute to the modern world. But what should be the components of this education? So going back to my earlier metaphor, what are the seeds that educators should be planting, hoping that they spring up in the future? I think the first seed that we need to plant is an appreciation for the ethical point of view. So for those who are teaching at a university with a Christian affiliation, we could certainly define the ethical point of view by focusing on the central teachings of Jesus, either in the Sermon on the Mount or the parable of the Last Judgment. So here are two snippets that go right at the heart of it. So this is one verse from the Sermon on the Mount, and of course it's the Golden Rule. And these are two verses from the parable of the Last Judgment. And certainly at Seattle University, Matthew 25 is a big deal, and it gets invoked a lot in terms of social justice and our mission to go out and create leaders who are graduate students who are going to be leaders for a just and humane world. It focused on social justice. So this is certainly one approach to defining the ethical point of view, but that's not how I do it, actually. We could do it, but first of all, when I started teaching ethics at Oregon State University, that was a public university 20 years ago when I started teaching ethics, and this isn't how you talk at a public university. And even at a Catholic university, I mean, at Seattle University, only about 30% of the undergraduates are Catholic, and probably I'd say maybe half of the undergraduates call themselves Christian. So we have a very diverse student body, and I don't think this approach is really the best approach to be getting students excited about the ethical point of view. There needs to be another way to present the material. So I do take a more generic approach, and this is how I do it. Imagine you're in a spaceship and you're hovering above the Earth on a cloudless night. As you look down upon our planet, you see beautiful constellations of artificial light. The stars in these incandescent galaxies are our communities. Communities provide many benefits to the people who live in them. They make people more secure against external dangers, and they facilitate the exchange of goods and services. Instead of every family assuming responsibility for all of their needs, such as food, housing, clothing, education, and healthcare, individuals can focus on particular activities. And any economist will tell you that when we specialize, then we end up with higher productivity and a higher standard of living. In addition, communities foster the development of fulfilling personal relationships. But if we're going to live in a community, there's a price associated with that. Every community has particular actions that they prohibit. There's other actions that they require. So there's an obligation associated with being in a community. There's a set of obligations. And if you don't conform to the prohibitions of the community and the requirements, then you can be punished. But the fact that almost everybody chooses to live in a community means that that's really strong evidence that the advantages of community life outweigh the costs or the obligations. So when we live in community, we need to look beyond ourselves. That's what community means. We need to take the needs and desires of others into consideration. As James Moore has put it, responsible community members recognize that virtually everybody shares certain core values: life, happiness, the ability to accomplish goals. And so the ethical point of view simply means that I'm going to make a decision that other people and their core values are worthy of consideration when I'm making decisions. It's essential for any serious study of ethics. And that's why it's the first seed we want to plant. It doesn't take a long time to cover this idea with students, but I think it's a foundation that needs to be laid because it's not too, you don't get into cases too much before students can slide into an egoistic way of evaluating things. It's good for me. Why can't I do it? And so I think the ethical point of view is really the first step, and we have to achieve closure on this perspective before we can move in and actually talk about an ethical theory. The second really important seed we need to plant is making ethics relevant. So how do we give our students an appreciation for the relevance of ethics? So in my mind, there's this triangle: ethics, current events, and the student. And what we're trying to do is strengthen all three connections. So what's the connection between ethics and current events? What's the connection between ethics and the personal lives of the students? And how do students relate to the real world? And throughout the course, we need to continuously reinforce these bonds. And by reinforcing all these bonds and making the triangle strong, that's a way to help the students see the relevance of ethics. Talking about actual engineering situations is the way to make the connection between ethics and current events, or ethics in the real world. Another way I reinforce the relevance of ethics to current events is to ask students to bring news stories to class for discussion. In my course, I also ask students to journal, and this is something I never did at Oregon State, but I learned after I came to Seattle University how important it is for students to write and to reflect. And so I ask, at the end of every major topic, I ask students to reflect on the relationship between the material and their personal life. So how has the material affected them? Reflection is a great way to establish that link between ethics and themselves, individual students, their personal lives. And I really have come to a greater appreciation every year of the importance of reflection as a key part of the learning process. It's a way in which students can get beyond just being in their head all the time and thinking of it as a purely intellectual exercise. So Ignatius of Loyola believed that deep reflection leads to the best decision-making, which he'd call discernment, learning, and growth. So to help you understand what I'm talking about, I want to dive a little bit deeper and give you a couple examples of reflections I've asked my students to write. So I'll give you a chance to read this. And here's another one from the end of the course. So do you see these words? Surprise, appreciation. We're really talking about an emotional reaction, right? The Jesuits have a name for this, affect. And affect is important because when students look back on their educational experience, we don't want them to remember it as a purely intellectual exercise, purely in their heads. We want them to remember an experience that engaged their emotions as well as their intellect, or you could say heart as well as mind. And the reason why is because if you make an emotional connection to the material, that can be a motivation for personal behavior change. So this is how Peter Hans Kolvenbach, the former superior general of the Jesuits, put it. When the heart is touched by direct experience, the mind may be challenged to change. So that's the second seed, making ethics relevant. And now the third seed, this is the big seed, skills and formal analysis. So we want our students to develop competency in looking at ethical problems and being able to use the tools of the formal theories to analyze them. So I think it's important that students be aware of all the formal theories, right? Principle-oriented theories like Kantianism, social contract theory, consequence-oriented theories, the various forms of utilitarianism, and then actor-oriented theories, by which I mean virtue ethics, right? Focusing on the character of the person making the decision. What I think is interesting is that when I've taught this course to graduate students, many of whom are from India and China, how many students have come to me and they've said, wow, I've never had this experience before. I've never had any practice looking at a moral problem and trying to analyze it in a formal way. And so for them, it has been a revelation to be able to know there is a way to think about making a decision as opposed to just following your gut or using your intuition. So that means we need to train students, right? How do we train students to use these theories? And that means we have to start working through cases. And so I would say we spend most of our time in the class looking at particular cases and discussing them and giving students the ability to learn how to analyze them. And so it's okay to start with simple cases where all the theories are going to come up with the same conclusion. Either you go through and they all agree that this is an okay thing to do, or this is not what you ought to be doing. Because at least it lets students sort of go through the motions. Because if you use the tool in the right way. So if Kantianism, of course, you got to be applying the categorical imperative. And if you've got utilitarianism, you have to weigh the benefits and the costs, and just going through the various steps and doing it in a rigorous way, even if it's a rather simple problem. But of course, it isn't going to be long before you end up with more complicated cases, and then you start seeing disagreement among the conclusions reached when you do the different analyses, and that's what makes for interesting discussions. And I think that one reason why so many computer science faculty, at any rate, are nervous about teaching ethics courses is because you have to get out of the pure lecture mode and you have to create situations like this where students are talking and how to lead a discussion. And that is a frightening thing if you're used to just standing up and lecturing and there's one right answer, and now it can be a little bit chaotic. But as far as I'm concerned, classroom discussions are absolutely essential. You can't run a course without them. Students have to have the opportunity to express their views, learn how to use their theories to reach a conclusion. And one of the great things about having good discussions is that students can learn to appreciate other perspectives. So here's a quote from a student in one of my classes. Attaching names, meanings, and characteristics to different moral systems was helpful in understanding others' viewpoints as well as identifying parts of my own belief system. Well, that's good, right? That's giving them the opportunity to grow as individuals and understand there's different ways of seeing a situation. So I think that can be a valuable outcome, a valuable growth experience for our students. But I have to admit, some students in my classes have drawn the wrong conclusion. And here's another quote from a reflection paper of one of my students. I decide what I want to do, and then I find the ethical theory supporting my decision. So I was shocked when I read that, and I wondered, what am I doing wrong? Alistair McIntyre has a name for this. He calls this the predicament of modern morality. And really what the student is talking about is putting a guise of objectivity over a self-interested decision. So one way to address this problem is to end each discussion by having a review of the arguments. Because the reality is some arguments are better than others. Maybe some people are basing their arguments on facts that might not actually be true, or they might be engaging in some kind of a logical fallacy like a slippery slope argument or something like that. In the best situation, when we're having these discussions, the students can learn how to call each other out, but that doesn't always happen. And so I think it's part of the role of the person teaching the course to help the students understand that all arguments are not created equal, and that some arguments are sounder than others. And that can be a delicate balance, because on the one hand, I don't want to put students down. I don't want students not to make a contribution because they're going to get slammed by the professor afterward. But at the same time, I think we do have to get away from this idea that every argument is as good as every other argument. And I think, in the best case, students can comment on each other, and then it's more of a peer-to-peer situation. If I'm going to do it, by doing it at the very end rather than in the middle, it sort of separates my feedback from the actual comment that the student made, and I think that gives the student a little bit of protection. There's other times at which a student is proposing an argument that's pretty obviously self-serving, and that's why I made such a big point out of establishing the ethical point of view at the beginning, because then if a student is putting together an argument that's pretty obviously self-serving, I can say, let's not forget, we're supposed to take other people and their values into consideration as well. Now, McIntyre would say the reason we have this predicament, the predicament of modern morality, is because Enlightenment theories have different definitions of the good. And when you have different definitions of the good, well, then you're going to reach different conclusions about what's the right course of action. So McIntyre's suggestion is, let's just throw away all the Enlightenment theories and go back to virtue ethics, and we'll have one vision of the good and problem solved. I'm not sure that idea is going to fly, and I think if I rewrote my book and took out Kantianism, utilitarianism, social contract theory, and just made it the virtuous software engineer, I don't think the book would be as well received. I think I think students need to be aware of these different ways of making decisions. And I think that when we start talking about rights and duties and benefits and harms, those are important concepts that students are able to work with. But I think the main thing is that what we're trying to get students to be is tuned in to ethics, to become aware of ethical issues that are arising in the course of their day-to-day life. And if they can be tuned into these issues and not just be wearing their blinders, I think that we've made a real contribution as people teaching ethics course. So as they gain experience, students are going to understand that you can't just input a problem, insert the facts, turn the cranks, and then the answer comes out. And this is something, at least in computer science, that students, many times they're a little bit upset to find out, because it's not like every other course that they've taken, right? Where you're trying to analyze an algorithm, and you can do the math, and you can figure out, okay, quicksort, it's optimal, we're not going to do any better than that, and problem solved, let's move on to the next one. And to come to an appreciation that when you're trying to solve an ethics problem, it's not just feeding in the data and turning the crank. There's a lot of judgment involved. And what is this case really about? What is the central issue? To try to separate the wheat from the chaff. And which issues are more relevant, which issues are less relevant. We also need to help our students understand that when we're looking at a complex situation, no one theory will capture the entire problem. So to put it another way, every ethical theory has a contribution to make, has a perspective that has merit. So according to Kant, every human being is equally valuable. And every interaction with another person should respect that person's rationality and autonomy. Utilitarians understand it's helpful to look at the consequences, right? We're trying to determine what are the beneficial consequences, what are the harms of a particular action. Social contract theory focuses on the individual collective benefits of protecting human rights. And virtue ethics is based on the idea that you can count on a virtuous person to do the right thing at the right time in the right way. I'd like to talk a little bit about the cases that we present students. In coming up with cases, one thing I've learned is that they really need to be realistic. They need to be meaty. I think some philosophers call them thick. But the idea is, if we have superficial descriptions of situations, if we have caricatures of people, then it doesn't lead to good discussions. Instead, what happens is students keep coming back asking for more details. Well, what about this, or what about that, or you didn't mention this. And so what I've learned is that we really need to have more sophisticated case studies. We need to put the freckles on the faces. And if we can create a deeper case, that can create for a much better discussion. So the students are talking with each other and hashing it out, as opposed to coming back constantly asking for more details. So from a practical point of view, what that means is I can't just type up a one-paragraph case, send it out to the class, and ask for a discussion. It ends up looking more like a page or two, which requires, of course, more time for the students to be just cogitating and trying to understand what's going on. But actually, I think that ends up making for better discussions. So when I first started running the ethics class, I'd have 24 students in the class, and I would just put the students around in a big circle, and we'd just talk. And that can be a real problem, because there's 3 or 4 students who want to do all the talking, and then what are the other students going to do? And a lot of the students, I felt, just weren't engaged. So when I do the discussions now, it's completely different. So we'll hand out the case. I'll ask every student to spend about 5 minutes just thinking about it and coming up with their own response. So for example, I might ask them, how would a utilitarian analyze this case? And after the students have had the opportunity to think about it for a few minutes, I put them in groups of 4 or 5. So that means I'd have half a dozen of these circles around the classroom, these small groups, and give the students the opportunity to talk about it. And then I ask people in the small, after they've done that for maybe 15 minutes, I ask them to report out. And in doing so, it really solves the problem of a few students dominating the conversation, because when I put them in these groups of 4 or 5, I've got half a dozen conversations happening all at once. So that means there are more people having the opportunity to speak. It makes it for kind of when I first started doing it, it was a little bit unsettling, because it is a little bit loud, but the students don't seem to be bothered by it, even if I'm a little bit nervous about it. And then I can go around from group to group and looking at listening and telling about when the small groups are done, and then I ask them to report out. And so by having the students, by doing the discussions in this way, it gets more students involved. We can have different students report out, and there just ends up being a lot better, a lot more opportunities for everybody to become engaged. Cases from the news are always the best. So for example, automating the job of driving is a hot topic right now. So I'm going to spend the rest of my talk doing a deep dive into this case, so you can get a sense of how a good case can raise a lot of interesting questions. So this image shows Joshua Brown, 40 years old, lives in Ohio, an avid Tesla owner. Really avid, 5,000 miles a month, okay? The first 9 months he had his car, he drove 45,000 miles in it. He installs internet systems to people in rural areas. In October 2014, Tesla began selling sedans with a $4,000 technology package that had ultrasonic sensors, a camera, front radar, digitally controlled brakes. The package allowed the car to stop before crashing. And then on October 14th, 2015, so just about a year ago, Tesla released a software update called Tesla version 7.0 to the 60,000 cars that it had sold with the technology package. And you probably know that Tesla's, the software gets upgraded, it's just downloaded. You don't have to go into the garage. It just happens while your car's in the garage, in your own private garage at home. And then the next morning you're running 7.0 as if by magic. So the new software enabled the car to control its speed and steer. Tesla named the update Autopilot, and this is what Tesla wrote on its webpage. While truly driverless cars are still a few years away, Tesla Autopilot functions like the systems that airplane pilots use when conditions are clear. The driver is still responsible for and ultimately in control of the car. That made Tesla the first automaker to release a product exhibiting level 3 automation, as defined by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Whoops. So here are the 5 levels of automation set up by the NHTSA. So level 0 means the driver is completely controlling the vehicle at all times. There's no automation. Level 1, some controls are automated. So for example, electronic stability control or automatic braking system. Level 2, at least 2 controls can be activated concurrently, such as adaptive cruise control and lane keeping. Level 3, under certain conditions, the driver can fully cede control of all safety critical functions. The car senses when control must be given back to the driver and provides a sufficiently comfortable transition time for the driver to do so. So this level 3 is the level of Tesla's autopilot system. And then level 4, the driver is not expected to control the vehicle at any time. So that would be a truly autonomous car. So officially, Tesla has continued to insist that its cars are not self-driving and that drivers must keep their hands on the steering wheel. So here's a quote from Elon Musk. "We're not yet at a stage where you can go to sleep and wake up at your destination." Yet Tesla automobiles continued to operate when drivers did not have their hands on the steering wheel. So here's a video from California on the freeway. Can you see him sleeping in the car? And stop and go traffic on a California freeway. On May 7th, 2016, Joshua Brown was killed when the Tesla he was in crashed into a tractor trailer on a Florida highway. The tractor trailer, traveling in the opposite direction on the highway, turned left in front of the Tesla. The Tesla was in autopilot mode. The computer did not see the trailer and the car did not slow down. One of the witnesses to the crash said that there was a DVD player inside the car playing a Harry Potter movie when they got to the car. Tesla didn't respond for nearly 2 months. Their first public response came on June 30th. They said, quote, "This is the first known fatality in just over 130 million miles where autopilot was activated. Among all vehicles in the US, there's a fatality every 94 million miles. Worldwide, there's a fatality approximately every 60 million miles. It is important to note that Tesla disables autopilot by default and requires explicit acknowledgement that the system is new technology and still in a public beta phase before it can be enabled. When drivers activate autopilot, the acknowledgement box explains, among other things, that autopilot is an assist feature that requires you to keep your hands on the steering wheel at all times, and that you need to maintain control and responsibility for your vehicle while using it. Additionally, every time that the autopilot is engaged, the car reminds the driver to always keep your hands on the wheel. Be prepared to take over at any time. The system also makes frequent checks to ensure that the driver's hands remain on the wheel and provides visual and audible alerts if hands-on is not detected. It then gradually slows down the car until hands-on is detected again." So that was their official statement. There's also customers in China who say that when the car was being demonstrated to them, that the salespeople would take their hands off the wheel to demonstrate the autopilot feature. So should Tesla have released a beta version of autopilot to the public? The accident killing Joshua Brown occurred on a divided highway. Should Tesla have added restrictions to the beta version of autopilot so that it could only be activated while driving on freeways? One of the things autopilot can't do is recognize a stoplight. When Brown's car hit the semi-trailer truck, it was traveling 74 miles per hour, 9 miles an hour over the speed limit. Should autopilot allow drivers to set a cruising speed above the speed limit? If so, how far? So Tesla has been praised for taking the Silicon Valley approach to out-innovate Detroit and to market an electric car that won accolades from Consumer Reports. They said it was the best car they'd ever tested. But I think that approach may have a dark side. A couple of years ago, I was visiting a software startup in Seattle. At one point, the chief technology officer told me about the importance of quickly adding new features to their website. We don't have time for formal software engineering methodology, he said. We need new functionality every day. I'd rather have my programmers implement new features quickly, even if they have to redo half of them because they aren't quite right. So I've spent some time trying to figure out, think of a case that's analogous to the case of the Tesla Autopilot. And not coming from a philosophy background, I'm a computer scientist. One thing I've learned is from the philosophers is you got to find the right analogy, right? Or what's the right comparable case? And after some thinking, I think the iPhone 4 is a good analogy. So in 2010, Apple introduced the iPhone 4. One of its design innovations was to introduce a metal band around the device that doubled as the antenna. Soon after the iPhone 4 was released, users began to complain that the signal strength dropped when the phone was held in such a way that a small black strip on the lower left side of the phone was covered by a finger or hand, sometimes leading to dropped calls. This was particularly a problem for left-handed users. Steve Jobs had a terse reply for these complaints. And in fact, it didn't take long for tech-savvy users to develop workarounds to the problem. Apple started giving away a rubber bumper that you could put around it. There were other cases that people devised to keep your finger from covering that strip. Another approach was to use good old duct tape. Now, Apple did have to deal with the bad press of Consumer Reports officially dropping its recommendation for the iPhone 4. So I think there's similarities between the Apple iPhone 4 and the Tesla Autopilot, but there's an important difference too. It's one thing if you drop a call or if your website crashes. It's something completely different if your car crashes. So does Tesla have a corporate culture that can balance innovation and safety? Detroit is certainly taking a different approach to this problem. So in 2015, before the Tesla accident, Ford announced its plans to introduce a self-driving car by 2021. It also said it was skipping level 3 because of its inherent difficulties. How can the computer ensure the driver is paying enough attention that it can pass over control in the case of an emergency? Ford said that in its tests, it took anywhere from 3 to 7 seconds, sometimes as long as 10 seconds, for a human being to respond adequately and retake control of a car. And this is called the handoff problem. And this is a big problem, right? Because in how many situations you're not going to have 7 seconds or 10 seconds before something bad happens. And I think it makes a lot of sense if, speaking from my personal experience, if I don't have to steer, if I don't have to use the gas, if everything is happening automatically, can I really be paying attention to what's going on, or am I going to start daydreaming? And if the car says, take over right now, how long is it going to take me to wake up and figure out, snap into it and understand what the heck is going on? So what Ford has done is they've said they are not going to sell an automobile with level 3 automation. They're going to skip that level. It does plan to start selling a car with level 4 automation in 2021. It would be something that you would use like Uber or Lyft, right? So it would be used inside cities as a taxi service. They would sell the car to taxi services. But it's not going to have a steering wheel. It's not going to have a gas pedal or a brake pedal. You're going to get in the car, and it's just the car is going to be driving. It's going to be absolutely clear that you are not controlling the car. You have no responsibility for where the car is going. So in the next edition of my book, you can bet I'm going to have a thorough case study on Tesla Autopilot. Because in my experience, this is the kind of case that can really capture the attention of students and stimulate deep, meaningful conversations. or discussions. So let me quickly recap the themes of my talk. First, a well-taught ethics course can provide students with lifelong benefits. Second, helping students cultivate an ethical mindset is central to the mission of a Catholic university. Third, we should seek the following outcomes. Graduates who are tuned into ethical issues and have the skills to address them in a thoughtful manner. Finally, a well-constructed computer ethics course helps students make connections between ethics, current events, and their personal lives. We accomplish this by providing plenty of relevant case studies, giving students the opportunity to practice applying formal ethical theories to realistic problems, and asking students to reflect on what they've learned. Thank you.
So there's time now for questions, and I invite you to come forward to speak into the mic so we can all hear you.
Hi. Mike, I gather you still teach ethics classes. Even as dean, with your deanly duties, you still...
I've been teaching, the past 3 summers I taught a course to graduate students. It was a hybrid course, so it was partly online. It was a little bit easier, but summer is about the only time I can teach anymore.
I see, I was wondering.
So this may have a connection to the story you just told about Tesla. I expect my kids to learn how to drive a standard shift, and they still do. And my daughter learned how to drive one. She also, of course, learned how to drive an automatic. One time driving the automatic, which she didn't drive very much, she made a left turn in front of a car and had a pretty bad head-on accident. Nobody was hurt, everything was fine. But from that day forth, she don't want to drive an automatic particularly because she believes that standard shift forces her to stay on track better, and she doesn't tend to daydream as much as she can in an automatic. So the connection between level 0, there's both standard, you don't even have standard shift technically up there in a sense, automatic. The connection's about the same. I'm able to daydream at level 4, and the problem of the hands, getting back to hands-on.
Right.
Well, there's a similar issue between standard shift and automatic. Does that mean there's something unethical about moving to an automatic from a standard shift? Which is, I guess, what you're implying about the issue with the Tesla car.
I think I think my primary concern with the Tesla is that this is the handoff problem is a known problem, and yet they released this beta product anyway. And there are so many limitations with this Autopilot. So, for example, it relies upon looking at the lane markings, and so if it's snowing, it's not going to work. Under some dark and rainy conditions, it doesn't work. It doesn't recognize street signs. Traffic signals. There's still a lot of confusion about how it's going to respond to poor driving on the part of human beings, right? When humans make mistakes, and can the system respond quickly enough? So there's a lot of unknown questions, and I think that I understand that that it's not going to be impossible to build a product that has a 100.0% safety rating. There are going to be accidents. The question is, what would be sort of a reasonable or prudent way in which to release this technology? And if you look at, for example, BMW, for their current product, which isn't level 3 but is like level 2+, it's only activated on freeways. It does not run on highways or arterials or side streets. And so BMW is trying to sort of limit the areas in which this technology is being used until there's a better sense of how reliable it can be.
And I think the discussion doesn't have to be, but should be in that way, because no matter what you do, you're going to get failures. The goal is to, minimize it as much as possible and make the ones that happen small enough that somebody doesn't die. So.
Right, yeah.
Thanks.
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit and say that, so yes, Tesla could in some ways they could have done things better. But in the end of the day, that person is very much responsible for not listening to saying that, you can't take your hands off the wheel. Why are you allegedly watching Harry Potter while you're driving? And so I guess you could in some way say you could do things better, but at the end of the day, aren't we meant to also how do you keep other people, force other people to be ethical and to make them concerned about safety, about their own safety?
I think that there's certainly evidence that Joshua Brown was behaving he wasn't following the instructions. Yeah. He was behaving in an irresponsible way. He was a super big Tesla fan. If you go to YouTube, you can find numerous Joshua Brown videos, including one he took on a freeway where a truck cut right in front of him. It was a truck with a big, it was some kind of utility truck, with the arm that goes up. And so it cut right in front of him, and the Tesla slowed down and swerved, and he credited the Tesla for keeping him out of an accident, and he had that up on YouTube. So he was an incredible Tesla fan. I think he enjoyed being on the leading edge of the technology. But I guess my point was, even if someone is trying to do the right thing and is trying to pay attention, are we asking too much of humans basically to have their hands on the wheel but not be responsible for anything hour after hour? And then there's a situation, and in 2 seconds they need to take control of the car and do the right thing. I think that's where I have my concern.
If I may, I want to ask actually another question. My wife's mom used to be made fun of all the time by her father when they would get in arguments, and he would always just say, "Oh, don't confuse me with the facts. I've already made up my mind." And I think that is incredibly relevant. And so you're talking about how you have students that are like, "Well, I just look for the right theory that proves my point." How do you get over? There are so many people who have. You can present them with fact after fact and logic after logic, and they just sort of refuse to accept that because of their own personal bias. How do you come across that with your students, and how do you overcome that?
Well, you can't always overcome it. So, for example, if you have one person who's a diehard utilitarian and they're simply going to look at the consequences, and someone else who's big into social contract theory and they believe that there are certain rights that you cannot violate, or you're strict Kantian and you believe you're not going to be dishonest no matter what the consequence is going to be, then you can have people who because they have different value systems are simply going to come to a disagreement on a particular issue. I think my concern is people who are being intellectually lazy and they just want to do what they want to do, which more often than not happens to be a rather selfish action, and then they're just looking for a way to rationalize or make an excuse for the selfish thing they're trying to do. And that's where I think that I think that's where there needs to be some pushback to try to encourage people to acknowledge the fact that their point of view is rather self-centered and isn't taking the common good into account.
Thank you. I appreciated your explanation of the Autopilot case. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you apply virtue ethics here? So I can see the two others. For virtue ethics, you could apply it to Joshua Brown, but the engineers working on it, or other persons, how do you apply it here? And you talked about effect. Can you elaborate more? How do you see effect here in this case?
So I'll start with the easy. So, affect in this particular case. So I guess when I was talking about affect, I was talking about the getting people to reflect on an experience in which they've had, particularly a learning experience, and try to get a sense of how they have been transformed or they have been influenced. And so if there's something that surprises me or shocks me or angers me or something that maybe gets me, awakens in me a passion I didn't know I have. Wow, I'm really interested in this. I'd like to learn more about this. That's also an emotional reaction. And so I think that, so I was talking about affect in the terms of, in the context of learning. As far as virtue ethics and the Autopilot case, I think that, you know, one of the challenges when you're a software engineer or any person who's part of a big team is there's sort of this, there's a difference between the individual and the collective, right? And so how is the collective going to operate? And sometimes, I know when I think of virtue ethics, I think of it more in terms of the character of an individual person and how they're going to operate. But then what would a virtuous person do in this situation, I suppose? And you know, Apple hasn't really, or Tesla hasn't really lifted the hood and let people see, I don't know, maybe you don't lift the hood on an electric car, but you just find a trunk in the front. But at any rate, you know, we don't really know exactly the discussions that happened in the course of leading to this. And but I think that, you know, one approach would be, whether I'm a hardware person or a software person, there are codes of ethics, and a big part of any code of ethics has to do with thinking about the public and not causing harm to the public. And I think that this is an area in which, you know, maybe that would be a fruitful way of thinking about it. Is, you know, how is this decision? I mean, how is this decision we are making, which is going to advance the prestige of our company and ensure that Tesla remains the sort of at the pinnacle of technological achievement? How are we balancing that against our responsibility not to harm the public, not to harm our customers? And I think that, you know, well, I have a hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that because Tesla wants to remain in existence and doesn't want to be overtaken by Ford or GM or any other larger car company, BMW, they have an incentive that they always have to be a couple of years ahead of everybody else. And that motivation encourages a certain amount of risk-taking that more established companies wouldn't take. But in this case, it seems to me like they've, you know, I believe they went too far.
Just small clarification, because on the pedagogical point of view, do you think then is it a good idea to just take this case and then invent a discussion? Suppose this happened in the Tesla company, these engineers discussing, because we had the same problems also developing real nice cases, but then the utilitarianism and Kantianism are easily applied, but to really apply virtue ethics, you really need the actual discussions between the engineers, I think. So,
right.
Do you think it's a good option to invent, or what could be?
If I were going to invent conversations, I think I would create a case that was totally hypothetical, wouldn't be based on something, because I feel, to me, it seems like mixing. You know, we have something that really happened, and then we're trying to space. So I think I would create something that were simply more hypothetical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I really have two things to say. A couple summers ago, there was a workshop for faculty. I'm a faculty member here. On mindfulness, and one of the subgroups was working on how to make small groups more mindful. So I thought I would just share a couple of their techniques.
Sure.
One was always to have students form different groups, because they tend to sit in the same space, and even if you have a small classroom, you really have to insist that they get up and move around. And those in the back tend to think that they don't have to move around. So you'll see, or there's one pair that moves around but always moves around together. So it's almost like you literally have to act like a parent and police them. And the other is to try to achieve gender differentiation, so to have both men and women represented, and then to come up with a common statement, which would work really well in an ethics situation where they actually have to draft a 1 or 2 sentence group response, or in your case, a solution. So they actually have to produce something for the larger group. And then the last was for some reason, some groups are very efficient and over-efficient and haven't been thoughtful enough. So what they have to do is get up and join another group. So like there may be 4 members and they each have to join a separate group that's still discussing. And it actually is interesting because the group that's already been, or that's still discussing, invites them in. They have insights, where you started, where were you. So those were some techniques that came out of the mindfulness workshop. And second, just out of gratitude, I've had opportunity for students to comment on the affective nature of the course. One student was just a freshman for a survey course. Her comment was, this was transformative, really. And I feel really blessed by that. And then I ran into a student several years after a Christian marriage class, and she said, oh, you made me cry 3 times. So I think students can be affected. I mean, it's a lot easier to talk about it in a Christian marriage class than in ethics and engineering, but I've been really blessed that way. So those are the 2 things I wanted to tell you.
Thank you for your comments. Those suggestions are very practical, and I've done a couple of them, but not all of them, so I really appreciate that. I think one of the, as far as affect is concerned, it's really heartwarming, has been heartwarming to me when a student comes up after the class and almost in a tone of surprise has said, what I'm learning here is helping me in my personal life too. So it's kind of a revelation, but it's, I've been in a situation with somebody and I was able to work it out because I've had this class, and that's a great thing to hear. So, I mean, for me, this has been, of all the courses I've taught, there's really something special about teaching ethics because it can have that affect on people.
Good morning, thank you. I wanted to ask about Alistair McIntyre in his book. He talks about basically degeneration of moral choices into emotivism. So people are just choosing what they prefer at the moment. And I think emotions are a really important part of human decision making. And I can tell you from teaching so many times students who cheat that emotion becomes very important in the moment of act, in the moment of making the choice. And I was wondering if there's a way that you try to address that in statements that, or in case studies that can become very cerebral. You can have a very strong distance away from, and you're making a judgment about something that's not your action. Is there a way that you can invest emotion in that so that they understand the difficulty of actually making a moral choice instead of judging? Thanks.
So I do think that students have an appreciation, even the ones who haven't worked in industry, when they start, if they really get into a case and they think about a situation an engineer might be in confronting management, or like we talked about the Challenger disaster or something like that, and we go through the, I can't remember who produced it, but there's a documentary that recreates the Challenger disaster. It goes on for several hours, and I don't make the students watch the whole thing, but there's about 20 minutes in the middle where Roger Boyce-Jolloy and the other engineers, they're trying to get the right thing to happen, and in the end, it doesn't happen. And I think when students are see a recreation of these events, it's pretty easy for them to understand how somebody can have an emotional response, for example, fear. Like, I'm afraid of losing my job, or there can be a response like that. So I think at some level the students do appreciate the fact that in the real world it's not a completely cerebral or intellectual exercise. And I think, in some sense, to me, one of the attractions of virtue ethics as opposed to, say, Kantianism is, Kant is so up there, cerebral. And this idea of, we're talking about sort of more of, the character that develops by repeating the virtuous action. And so it becomes part of who you are, becomes basically your instinct, or your general inclination to move in a particular direction. So for example, if you are an honest person, you get uncomfortable simply at the suggestion of doing a dishonest thing. It just doesn't sit well in your gut. And so in that respect, I think the virtue ethics approach is a little bit, is more holistic perhaps than some of the Enlightenment theories.
Okay, so thank you very much. Join me in thanking our speaker. Thank you.